Welcome to a tale shrouded in mystery and darkness, where the desert whispers secrets and the walls hold unspeakable truths. Join me on a journey into the heart of fear, where every brushstroke reveals a deeper horror, and every word uncovers a chilling reality. Nothing gives us the right to be this cruel. The words greet me every day on my way to work. It takes me 2 hours of driving alone through the desert to reach the abandoned chicken farm where they are sprawled across the front entrance. Used to be they had a driver pick me up and take me, but after Hector, I asked them to stop sending one. I liked Hector and didn't fancy going through it all again. Besides, I've been doing the job long enough they can trust me. Don't need anyone standing over my shoulder. Most people they tried getting to do this job didn't stick it more than a few weeks. Some found it too boring. Others found it a little too exciting. Job's easy enough if you have the right frame of mind. All I gotta do is paint a wall. It's not far from the farm, technically on the land, but in reality belonging to the desert. 10 feet by 10 feet, a slab of solid stone. Every day I drive out and paint that wall top to bottom with a mixture of resin and tar. I try not to think of who put the wall out here, just like I try not to think why a non-existent branch of the US government pays me 6 figures to paint it. But I do know I ain't hired to paint this thing for aesthetics. I'm hired to cover whatever's under there. Whatever's drinking the resin and tar I slap all over it day after day, because even though I've been doing this for 25 years, when I come around every morning, I can see the last coat starting to fade away like it's been on there 100 years. So I paint it again, cover it top to bottom, day after day. Something's on the other side, and it's drinking the foul concoction layer by layer. I try not to think about it. Whoever's paying me to do this has the right idea. Paint the wall. Forget about it. Don't dwell on it. Just cover the fucking thing. Keep whatever's lurking under all that heavy tar out of sight and out of mind. People come sometimes and make offerings to the wall, and that's a bad idea. If they come at daytime, I shoo them away, but it don't always work. I tell them not to pray to the wall. It only brings bad luck, but they do anyway. They kneel in front of it, heads pressed to the sand, and they pray to that rotten slab of stone, thinking it was sent by a loving God. After that, they drive away, and if I'm lucky, I never hear from them again. If I'm unlucky, they're on the news the next day, what's left of them. Sometimes they come at night to make their little offerings. I know they've been because their cars are still here come morning. No sign of the pilgrims, though. Just the trinkets and prayer beads they leave behind. Maybe some scuffled sand in front of the wall, or a trail of clothes leading into the desert. One time there was a baby carrier, but no baby. Used to be, I'd call the cops and they'd come tow the cars away and file missing persons reports. But now, they tell me to just roll the cars out the way so they can come get them at a later time. Only they never do. I parked them up a quarter-mile out west, and I'd say there's about a couple hundred of them out there now. It'd be a pain to store them if there weren't so much room. No one's running out of desert. The cars sit squat and idle in the heat, day in, day out. Faded pastel paint jobs robbed of their gloss by the harsh desert winds. Fuzzy dice, keychains that jingle still hanging from the ignition. Tiny Virgin Mary figurines glued to the dashboard. Hector used to take spare parts from them, but he stopped after the third accident. Eventually came to the conclusion the parts were cursed like everything else around here. It's that wall. It hurts everything around it. Even the soil is poisoned. Wouldn't surprise me if it's the real reason there's a desert here. Ain't nothing to do with geography. It's the wall sucking the life out of everything around it like a black hole. Just look at the old chicken farm with its gates covered in graffiti. It's where I lunch, where I parked my car up under the shelter of old corrugated roofs. The owner didn't think anything of taking his business out here. Thought the heat and the the isolation would make it harder for the animal rights activists to follow, but it only pissed them off more. Like so many others, he saw the freestanding slab of cement in the middle of the desert and figured it was a quirk. A remnant of a forgotten building that just so happened to be on his land. He didn't realize it was a poison well that would leave him hanging in a rundown jailhouse. The fire that shut the farm wasn't even that big, but a fire doesn't have to be big when it starts in a room with 4,000 chickens and a couple hundred men and women, many of whom don't speak English. It didn't stop the two supervisors in there from screaming at them like they did, throwing fuel on the panic and making it 100 times worse. Add on the fact the fire exit was padlocked and very few made it out alive. The crematorium soot that now carpets the floor absorbs any sound you make as you walk, lends the place the hushed vibes of an old church. Can't escape the feeling that something in there don't want to be disturbed. The owner blamed the activists who protested there every single day, said he had to lock the door to keep them out. If there'd been plenty of survivors, he might have gotten away with that kind of excuse. But as it was, only 40 people made it out alive, so they pretty much had to throw the book at him. They even reckon someone fell in the macerator during the panic. The gnarly-looking machine they used to churn up male chicks, so no meat went to waste. I looked into it once and noticed a lot of the blades are chipped and broken, like something a little too heavy for the machine's specifications fell in. It wasn't built for something as big as a person. The motors would have struggled. The blades would have dug in only so far before stalling and trying again and again and again. Removing him would have been like clearing a paper jam. It would have been better to just go through all the way in a single go, head first. At least that's what I think. When I asked around, some of the workers remembered the wall, always visible against the wavering lines of the heat-struck floor like a little door to nowhere. It's funny. If you press people on it, they'll say it's just brick and mortar, some old building that didn't get torn down properly. But they'll change the subject quickly. Won't postulate on its origins for longer than a second at most. At least I found that even back in the day, there was a guy who hauled ass up there to paint the thing top to bottom. Just goes to show this job of mine goes back a while. The wall spoke to Hector before he went missing. It's spoken to me a few times too, usually in the morning when I first arrive and haven't had time to apply a new coat of tar. It's a struggle not to listen, but Hector found it harder than most. Something about that farm just bothered him, made him easy pickings. He hated it, hated what it represented. Industrial farming, humans at our worst. You'll know what he means if you ever see one of these places up close. Those cages, thousands of them all lined up in row after row, they're still there and the fire didn't burn it all away. You can smell the rot of infection on them, sickly sweet and foul. Feathers still clinging to rusted metal bars, living things pressed in so close. The wireframe metal would sometimes flay the skin like cheese wire and leave raw, swollen flesh exposed to hot desert air. Hector said the wall put that idea in the farmer's head, and from there, it spread across the world. When I argued that people have never needed help being cruel, that we as a species have been fucking evil for a lot longer than the wall's been around, he pointed out that I didn't know how old it really was. Maybe it's been standing for as long as we have, leaking its infection into our species like a splinter in hot flesh. I don't know why, but that scared me. The thought of my Neolithic ancestors banging rocks together, while that thing stood alone in a desert halfway round the world, just waiting for me to come to it. Knowing that the tumbling passage of history would eventually bring the two of us together. That whole line of thinking scares me shitless. Something about the wall broke Hector, but out of all of us, I think he understood it the most. At first, he thought it was a joke. Spent months poring over the farm, obsessed with finding cameras. He later admitted he was having nightmares. So was I. But they fucked with him something special. Left him sobbing on the bathroom floor while his 2 little girls and wife struggled to understand what was changing the man they loved. He would have given anything to find out it was all a hoax, that he'd just let his imagination get to him, and that the dreams didn't really mean anything. Never told me what he saw in those dreams, but if they were anything like mine, they were shapeless narratives of violation that left him squealing like a pig in his bed, drenched in sweat and piss. Despite all this, he lasted the longest of any driver I ever had. It was like that thing had its hooks in him good and proper, and it wasn't going to let him off easy. Most guys who had the job before him simply disappeared. The very first guy was like that. He was a big man and much older than me. This was back when I first got the job, when no one was sure I'd last at the job, and the driver was there to make sure I actually painted the damn wall and didn't run off screaming into the desert after the first 5 minutes. Part bouncer, part chauffeur, he would stand behind me with arms crossed and a cigarette between his lips. On the 11th day, he left me so he could go take a piss and never returned. He couldn't have been 20 feet behind me, and there wasn't so much as a peep to indicate a struggle. All I found of him was a wet patch of sand, 2 footprints shoulder-width apart, and a strip of skin about a foot long that could have come from anywhere. Most of them don't even leave that much behind. Sometimes they get bored and go exploring only to never come back. Other times they'll turn a corner as they walk just ahead of me, and when I catch up, there's just empty air where they were stood seconds before. Not all of them are that quick and clean, though. A few have left big messes. By far the worst was Hector's predecessor. Didn't even last 2 days. Silly Man took his friends up to the farm at night, camped in it, showed them the wall, and let them all get drunk and play games. When he didn't turn up for work that morning, I drove myself up and found the remnants of their little party. One guy, still alive, was using the beak snipper to amputate his arm 1 inch at a time. Little cubes of himself lay at his feet, many of them still moving. Another, some poor girl, was all tied up in the outer fence. At first it looked like she tried running and got tangled in the waist-high wires, but when I got closer, I saw that a whole load of the stuff had been bunched up and was now running through her mouth and out the other end. No sign that it was ever removed from the post, so God knows how it got worked through her digestive tract like that. But at least she was dead by the time I found her. Although, judging by the finger marks she left in the sand, she'd hung there suspended for a good while, scrabbling at the dirt, desperate for purchase. The worst was the girl who'd been crammed into the cages, and I do mean plural. One cage, less than 1 foot square, had her torso all bent up and crammed in there. Wireframe squeezing her belly fat and making shallow cuts that repeated over and over like the lines of a sketch. Another cage had her right arm, head, neck, and shoulder. The ball and socket joint was dislocated so badly it nearly broke the skin. Beside it was another cage with her other arm and most of her back that had been whipped so bad there was hardly any skin left. Another cage had her pelvis. All in all, she was split across 8, maybe 9 cages, some of which were all the way on the other side of the room. And somehow, I don't know how, she was still alive. All of her at once. She was like a doll that'd been taken apart. I don't know it was possible. She was even stroking her own face with an arm that wasn't attached no more, the fingers reaching through the bars as she quietly snibbled and sucked on her thumb. Broken glassy eyes fixed me, but there was nothing behind them except despair. And the driver, all I found of him was a single foot sticking out of the wall. Acting on instinct, I grabbed his ankle and pulled, and the damn thing came away like I was carving up a well-cooked turkey. It just fell off, leaving a little bloody nub of leg sticking out of the tar that kept on wiggling. letting me know its poor owner was well aware of what had just happened. There was no helping him, though. I knew that much. So I called my boss to pick up the others and got to work on my job because something that boy had done had agitated the wall. The tar was fading fast, like water on hot sand, and I knew that if too much of the stonework underneath got exposed, then it'd be all over for me. So I grabbed my tools and got to work and tried to ignore the way what was left of his leg would thrash every time the hot brush touched it. Stayed like that for weeks, wriggling each time I painted the wall. You'd figure he'd suffocate or die of thirst eventually. But no, his leg just faded slowly over the course of a month or two, sensitive to the brush right till the end. If I had to guess, he's still on the other side. That's its secret, you see. The walls. Just one of many secrets it has, but that's the one it plies you with, and it's the one that works. Mortality is just a bit of clay for it to play with. Life, death, don't mean nothing to what's on the other side. Hector told me he was a God-fearing man, told me death didn't scare him, but the wall doesn't brook fables and fairy tales. You try standing in front of it saying you don't fear death because you're gonna go up to some grand old VIP after party where humanity's long-lost dad'll keep you safe, and you'll feel the faith just drain right out of you. And in its place, there's the wall and the things it can show you. It took Hector's faith. First time I told him there's nothing after death, he called me a cynic. 2 years of staring at that wall, at the shifting patterns and the obsidian filth, he changed his tune, told me nothing was the best we could hope for, told me he saw what was really waiting for us, got shown it in his dreams. I knew what he meant. I'd been there too. Glimpses of what waits for us after death. Makes the things we do to our livestock seem gentle. It's nothing but filth and misery, subservience and suffering. A despair that stretches out in all directions, past, present, future. It consumes it all. Time has no meaning in those nightmares. It's like tracing a Mobius strip with your finger. I wanted to say the wall was lying, but, well, those dreams, it didn't feel like a lie. I knew things were bad when Hector started driving up on his own. I'd turn up and find him there, just sat in front of it. He didn't whisper or pray. I guess at this stage he was just listening to find out more. Bargaining, negotiating. If I had even the slightest idea what he was planning. I'm not sure how he even found the barrels, but he did. I turned up one day, and he was there sitting cross-legged with a massive steel drum barrel laid out horizontally just in front of him. I knew the story behind those barrels, just like I knew it ended with them being welded shut, padlocked, driven out 10 miles into the desert, and buried as deep as 10 men could dig in a single day. How the fuck he got one out and rolled it all the way back to the farm, I'll never know, but the sight of it turned my blood to ice. Hector, I said as I wandered over, you need to step away from that thing. You know what it is? He didn't ask. He just knew. Yeah, I said. You know I dug around a bit back in the day. Got a lot of stories about this place. Never told me this one. Didn't want to, I replied. Tell me now. I don't. If you tell me, I'll leave. If you don't, I'm going into my truck and getting my tools, and I ain't leaving till it's opened. Something about the way he spoke let me know he was telling the truth. All right, I said. It's just a story, that's all. Those barrels were left behind from the farm, I told him. Back when it was still up running, they'd take all the chicken shit, pack it up, and sell it on to other farms who used it for fertilizer. This stuff would spend weeks baking in the desert heat, sealed in metal barrels, before it finally got put on a truck and sold. It wasn't a priority, just a cost-cutting measure. Loading them up on a pickup truck that came once a month was the sort of job they gave to newbies, or guys who didn't look busy enough when the owner came round. Usually it was a group job, but one poor guy had the bad luck of being called up on a particularly hot day to do the loading all by himself. Maybe he pissed his supervisor off. Maybe the usual guys were off sick and they were shorthanded. Doesn't matter. Poor fucker spent hours all on his own round back of the farm, away from all packaging and processing and all that noise, struggling with these big old barrels full of rancid chicken shit. Each one damn near took him 15 minutes to move, I said. Terrible job, and he had no help. He was about halfway through it and struggling with one particular barrel, doing his best to lift it onto the truck with the hot metal pressed against his face, when he heard something he'd never heard before. A little tap, tap, tap coming from the inside. His first reaction was to cry out and drop the drum, letting it hit the sand with a bassy thud. By the time the dust had settled, all he could really think was that it was good. No one was around to hear him shriek like a little girl. He laughed it off, as you do. Figured it must have been something that had come loose and was knocking about. A bit of metal off the rim, maybe. So he took a breath and was just about ready to bend over and get back to the job when it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time he kept his composure, but the fear stuck around. Something about the rhythm of the knocks didn't sound right. He froze. Couldn't bring himself to get any closer. He just stared at the thing, sweat running off his brow as the seconds ticked on. He was thinking something crazy. He knew it was nuts, and he knew it was only really bothering him because he was all alone and his imagination was running wild. Whatever was making that noise, it couldn't be anything to worry about, he told himself. That barrel had been filled and sealed 3 weeks before. Nothing could be alive in there. So to put this idea out of his head, to prove his own imagination wrong, he walked up to the barrel, and with a curled knuckle, he rapped out the first part of 2 shaves and a haircut. Tap, 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 tap. And when he heard a response, tap, tap, that was when he started screaming like crazy. Drew the other workers over, and when they heard it too, they decided to call the cops. The official story was that those men turned up and found a body. A vagrant, they reckoned, who tried sleeping in one of the barrels but had the misfortune to still be there, passed out from booze when it got filled up, and the poor fucker drowned without ever coming to. The tapping sound was just his head knocking against the inside of the barrel. It's just another story of suffering, I added as the silence drew on. The wall attracts them. You know that. Lots of people die around that thing. Accidental deaths that are nasty as hell, but accidental nonetheless. There's more to it than that, Hector muttered, his voice dry and hoarse, but strangely loud in the silence of a desert morning. When it was all done, they shut the farm down for the day, and those police and a couple strong workers drove every barrel in that shipment out into the desert and buried them deep, deep down in the middle of nowhere. Now why would they do that? He laughed, and he'd never looked so crooked and broken in his life. He looked ill, and my heart sank just to see it. Hector. He was still laughing when he raised a fist and struck the side of the barrel. Thump, thump, thump. Silence. He stopped laughing. I couldn't bring myself to move a muscle. I was so scared. We both just waited for the inevitable. Thump, thump, thump. There was no denying where that sound came from. Something had responded from inside the barrel. Could have sworn that knocking sound echoed around the empty valley so loud it shook the sand beneath my feet. The kind of hollow booming that swallows you up whole. Felt like it took a whole minute just for the echo to die down. Fucking vagrant. Hector chuckled as he stood up. Weren't no vagrant. Weren't nothing so simple. It was an acolyte, a follower. He crawled in and waited on purpose because of what the wall had told him. Hector, you're fired, I said, certain that I should have done this a while ago, but he just laughed so hard he was nearly sick. Fine, fuck you too, he said. It enjoys it, you know? The wall. We ain't tricking it or trapping it, doing what we do. We think we can keep it at bay by what? Covering the doorway? It likes it. It likes that we come out here and that we do this to it. It's like fucking foreplay for the thing. You've got kids, Hector, a family. Just go home. I'll take it from here. "Tell me the rest," he said. "You know the rest of the story. Tell me." "I think you already know," I replied. "Tell me," he screamed, and his fists clenched. Hector was a wiry guy, but I knew he had a history that made men like me look soft and gentle. Time had smoothed out his rough edges, and at heart, he was a decent guy. But he was a fighter, an experienced one, and I had no hopes of beating him. "All right," I said. "You're right. I spoke to the cops. I found them and spoke to them, and they told me what they saw. They told me that they took the call and made the long drive out here, not expecting much. First thing they saw when they turned up was just some poor guy in his undies out front, being comforted by half a dozen workers. He'd pissed himself, and they didn't have clean clothes. Cops thought this was pretty funny, but the owner of the farm was nearby, and he seemed to take it seriously, so they thought they'd at least give it a look around. They walked out back, found the drum and a crowbar, and pried it open. Not wanting to actually look inside, they kicked it over, a baking hot barrel of chicken shit, and emptied its contents onto the bone-dry desert floor. Hector seemed to get excited by this part of the story, and he seized the opportunity to finish it for me. And as they watched the bubbling brown goo disperse into nothing, they saw it, he hissed gleefully. A nightmare. A skeleton of a man, his flesh steaming and skinless. A living figure who was somehow against all odds, alive and reaching for his throat, gasping desperately. Those cops stood frozen with terror as they watched the man clear his own windpipe, digging shit out of his esophagus with his fingers, before he took desperate breath and started screaming. And screaming, gibbering and howling, and not just about nothing either. He told them about the dark secrets he'd learned as his flesh fermented in oily shit. Secrets about that desert, about the world and man and his place in it, and the doorway not far from where they stood that could tell them all about it if they only wanted to look. "It's right fucking there," he screamed so loud that he went red in the face. "A way out. The wall is the only thing that can stop us dying and crossing over into that fucking endless nightmare." "It's a trick," I said. "You can't trust that thing." "I don't have to," he said in a dreamy whisper. "I've seen it. And if you were honest, you'd at least admit it scared the shit out of you, too. There ain't no fucking heaven and hell. There's just that fucking farm, only we're inside the cages. And our cruelty doesn't even compare to theirs. Death is just a fancy idea they put into our head for fun. This," he gestured to the desert around us, "this is a fucking dream, and it's not even a good one. A rock in the middle of an infinite abyss, the smartest, strongest animal alive. Build skyscrapers, build space stations, a little Garden of Eden just for us. It's a joke. They're laughing at us. They want it to hurt when we finally wake up. The best any of us can hope for is to put as much as space between us and what's on the other side. Every second spent here and not there is a golden victory to be treasured." That's what that man came out of the barrel to scream about. That's the secret he was telling those workers. He was saying, get in the fucking barrel too, because it's better than what's waiting for us. And with that desperate breathy rant, he gave up, doubled over, vomited what looked like the same tar and resin we painted the wall with, and passed out. I could tell by the way he shivered and went all pale he needed to see a doctor. Something perverse was going on inside of him. I dragged him to my car, loaded him up, and drove him to the hospital, all the while doing my best to ignore the fact I'd left the wall looking pretty bare. By the time I got him there and spoke to the doctors, it was already 2 in the afternoon. But I couldn't just leave him to rot in the waiting room. I had to get him set up, and it was only then, when the day was already reaching 4 o'clock, that I managed to get out of the hospital and back in my car. I drove through the desert at a reckless speed. I'd never let the wall go more than 24 hours without another lick of paint. This job was about more than the money. It was about keeping something locked in. Something so dangerous it had already poisoned the lives of hundreds, and I knew it could poison so much more if allowed to. The sun was already setting by the time I arrived. Strange lights blared from the farm, noises that sounded like celebration and hysterical screams, so I swerved to avoid it entirely. I came off the road and mounted the desert itself, veering around the farm and heading straight towards the wall. When I found it, it glowed black in the darkness. I don't know how else to describe it. It glowed a sort of radiant, oily darkness, a shadow within a shadow. The drum was where we'd left it, only now it was shaking like crazy. I did my best to ignore it, as I grabbed my tools from the car and began to paint the wall, lit only headlights. Up close, it looked a funny sort of white. I mean, it was black, but it was like it was lit up from within by a different light, something else underneath it. Never seen it look like that. It made me think of the moon. Pale dust and craggy features glimpsed from afar. I never painted the fucking thing so fast in my entire life. I practically threw the brush around like a knife, and towards the end, as I started to feel a sort of tingling electric charge in the air that scared the living shit out of me, I gave up on the brush entirely and just grabbed cans of paint whole and threw them on there. It was a messy job, but in the end, it seemed to work. The air calmed down. The lights from the farm faded, and when I looked back at the wall, it looked like just that, a wall with a bad paint job. It had all happened so fast and in such a rush, I didn't even notice I had burns all over my hands just from letting them get close to it. Hurt like hell as the adrenaline rush faded, but it was fucking worth it just to close that thing up before it got any worse. I started to laugh. I'd never had a close call like that, never let it go that long without a coat. The relief was almost orgasmic, even if I'd fucked up my hands and ruined my car's suspension. I was still laughing when the lid popped off the drum behind me. Jesus Christ, the noise as it emptied. I stood facing the wall and just listened to that god-awful sound. Gloop, gloop, gloop. When the smell hit me, I knew I'd have to turn around. I did so, only to find myself blinded by my car's lights. Dumbass, I thought to myself. I couldn't see shit and I had no torch either. But the faint sound of something groaning and thrashing let me know I wasn't alone. I sprinted to the car and dived in through an open window. I was upright and in the driver's seat before I even had time to think, and next thing you know, I was looking up at the wall, lit by my car's lights, and in full view like it was showing off. I saw what had come out of the barrel. The stories didn't do it justice. Decay is transformative. All death becomes new life. You ever seen what happens to a whale at the bottom of the sea? But death, decay, even as it fertilizes and nourishes it, is still at its core entropic. Something organized becomes disorganized. The body turns to mulch, even if for a while it flourishes with the new life of maggots, worms, bacteria, and fungi. It's an arrow. It goes from A to B. But the thing in front of me, the man who had stewed in oxygen-deprived animal shit for 2 decades, it was like that arrow had become a circle. Like the maggots and the fungi had fed freely, but he had stayed organized. He had not dissipated or dissolved. He was alive, and he was screaming. And he ran, still screaming, right towards me, and I managed to fumble 1 foot onto the accelerator just in time to realize I'd never put the car in reverse. The car jerked forward, hit him hard enough to prove what was stronger, and by the time I backed up, all that was left was a smear on the hood, the color of a smoker's spit, and what looked like strips of beef jerky and gravy strewn all over the desert floor. He kept screaming even as I backed up and fled. I kept the car in reverse for a full 2 miles before I finally calmed myself enough to pull over and turn it around. Without even realizing it, I drove the rest of the way to the hospital to check on Hector. By the time some kind of lucidity came back to me, I was sat beside him with my head in my hands, wondering if it was time to call up my boss and tell them to find another idiot to do this job. "Are you his family?" I looked up and saw a doctor looking at me. "No," I replied. I gave the hospital his wife's contact details when I dropped him off earlier. Oh, the doctor mused. He hasn't had any visitors. You sure you gave them to front desk? Maybe check the details are right. The infection in his blood is serious, and if he has family, they really ought to know where he is. No one's visited him? I asked. His phone, no one's called it? No one's come looking for him? The doctor shrugged and shook their head. You're right, I muttered. Must have given the wrong number. I'll go check on it now. The doctor accepted this and left me and Hector alone. I took out my phone a couple of times. Thought about calling his wife's number, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth. I knew for a fact it was the right one. He used it all the time to call me all the time when his own didn't work, which was often. What the fuck have you done? I whispered to myself as I stared at her number. I found a way. Hector was awake, his eyes fixed at the ceiling, but glassy and blank. He didn't look at me, not even when he kept talking. What did you do? I prayed to the God in the desert, he said, and it was kind enough to show me a way, not for me, but for them. I could have died of heartbreak looking at him there and then. He was broken. The wall could have just taken him like the others, but it didn't, and somehow that was worse, seeing him reduced and made so low. I didn't speak to him again. I left him there in the hospital. I don't even know if he died or if he's slinking around the streets doing God knows what. When I returned to the desert the next day, I found the remnants of the old barrel and the stain on the sand from its contents. What was left of the man inside had been scattered by the wind and scavengers. Back on the farm, I found what Hector had left behind. 3 barrels, brand new, 1 big, 2 small, nothing like the old ones. He'd sourced these himself. It was on a dark impulse that I took out my phone and tried his wife's number. Shouldn't have been surprised when I heard it ring on the inside, a muted digital tinkling. The sound woke up the woman inside, and the barrel shook as its contents tried violently to escape. But they'd already been in there for a day, stewing in God knows what, because it wasn't like Hector could have used chicken shit. And the wall wasn't far away, its effect radiating out as surely as heat from a fire. They couldn't be alive in there. Not alive as you or I understand it. They belong to the wall now, and like everything else about it, they'd be best forgotten about. So I called my boss, and we organized another dig out in the desert. And when we were done, I painted the wall.